In terms of news and information, so what's going on in the Middle East or the financial crisis here, or sports stories, can you talk about how people are discovering news content as well as consuming that content? So how they're discovering it and where they're consuming it?
A lot of the discovery is now taking place through social networks. We know people, particularly younger people, who tell us that they wake up in the morning and they log on to Facebook or Twitter and get recommendations. They follow what their friends are following or watch what their friends have already viewed, and will click on the links in the tweet or in the wall posting. There are a lot of people now who are media grazers. Instead of living by appointments with media, the newspaper on your front stoop in the morning, the radio broadcast at the top of the hour, the TV newscast at a set hour of the night, people are now watching the news on their schedule. They're in charge of the news playlist in the way that they're in charge of their music playlist now. And so they're much more likely to be grazing at times of the day when it makes sense for them and when it matters to them, and they're not necessarily living by the appointed times that the media is delivered to them. So it's a big change in people's expectations about what's available and when it's available. It's a big change in their media diet. You know, they're getting a lot more stuff that matters to them rather than stuff that's curated by news companies. And so there's a big challenge now in this environment from a sort of political science perspective of whether people are tightening in on their information bubbles and only encountering information or only encountering people that are like them. That's not a good thing for a polity, and so there are lots of people who are worried about that. One of the great things that the traditional media have always done is delivered to people spontaneous experiences of things that they didn't know that they cared about until they learned about them in a newspaper or on a broadcast. And so those experiences probably are diminishing in the number of times that they happen in this day and age, and there's a reason to worry that, you know, as we tighten our filters, that we'll become sort of less attuned to the world around us.
Just playing devil's advocate, do you think that concern is sort of being overblown or over-exaggerated, given that, you know, 5-10 years ago, somebody politically on the right is having a daily diet of Fox News and the Wall Street Journal. Somebody on the left is having a daily diet of MSNBC and the New York Times. They're not exactly going too much outside their bubble and their comfort zone 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. I mean, I understand that, you know, one of the big debates today is, you know, technology companies fine-tuning your experience when you hit the homepage of a publication or do a search to show stuff that you've shown interest in or your friends show interest in, which gets to your point of, you know, kind of that myopic, not getting other viewpoints. But haven't we always had that?
It's people have always gravitated to the things that seem more attuned to them and more relevant to them. So this is a very deeply human trait that's played out since media first entered our lives in the cave paintings, probably. You know, there are certain caves that had great paintings for one village and other cave paintings mattered to other villages. So that's a very deeply human trait. What we've found is that it's not so much the people who are actively filtering their environment. The big differentiator is whether people are interested in these subjects at all or not. So it's not red truth and blue truth or conservative truth and liberal truth. It's more people who care about politics get a lot of information, and this is like heaven for them because they can get more from more places and more people and cross-check it and fact-check it and you know it's just a smorgasbord and they love it. It's the people who don't care about politics in the pre-internet age. They pretty much, if they wanted to watch TV at 6:30 at night, they had to get news. So at least casually, they were aware of more things now than people who are indifferent to news, because they've got people now who are indifferent to news just have lots of other options of how to spend their time with media. They can play games, they can hang out with their social networking friends, they can watch, you know, sports, they can check financial sites, and so there's not any great sense that the partisan folks are only getting it from their separate domains. It's a sense that the active people are really separating out now from the inactive and uncaring people, and that's a different kind of concern for the culture. It's mostly, you know, are certain people feeling like they don't now have a place or a voice in politics rather than, you know, the wrong teams in power.
Do you do research around kind of like journalism and what journalists are doing? Because I know, there have been studies coming out recently or questionnaires and surveys of, are you using things like Twitter to verify stories or get primary information or multiple sources of information? Can you talk about that at all?
Yeah, we've done a bunch of work with our colleagues down the hall at another Pew-funded project that has looked at how people have changed their news diet and their news habits in this environment. One of the most interesting things is that the people who are into news now get it on multiple platforms in multiple ways and multiple times of day now. So if they're in their car, they might be listening to the radio. If they're sitting in their den, they might be reading TV. If they're at work, they'll be checking on their desktop. And so there's partly a time of day and convenience element to this. And a lot of people now are supplementing their media diet with things that they can find online. So if they really care about a subject, they will go to try to find the primary sources, or they will try to get an alternative point of view from the one that seems to be most heavily promoted in the story they've just read. It's not everybody. People are just interested in the news and they want to check in on headlines and then check out and move on to other things. But people who really, really care now have tons of alternatives to dig deeper into a story, to go to primary sources, to read alternative points of view. One of the most common things we've seen, particularly on foreign stories, is that Americans will start maybe with basic information about the news story from an American news organization, but then cross-check or amplify what they think they know by going to foreign sources. And there are a lot of people now who sort of by default think, I'm going to check multiple places now to just see how this is playing in Europe or see how it's playing in the Middle East or something like that. So people are a little bit more scattered. News is sort of omnipresent, and they don't necessarily feel like they have to focus on it or devote themselves to it in the way probably their parents and grandparents did. But there are easy ways now to just dive deeply into anything that sort of catches your attention if you care about it.
So in addition to consumers consuming their news, what about journalists who are actually the producers of news content? Are you seeing stuff where they're, now using sources such as Twitter to verify stories and actually, when you check the box of did I fact check this, did I verify this, they're saying in their mind, oh yeah, I got some tweet verification from on the ground there, or Facebook verification or something like that.
There are clearly ways that this has changed the workaday world of journalists. At one level, they are composing their stories, whether it's in a text or video or an audio format, with a much more vivid sense than I had when I was a journalist, that there are people out there watching who are going to pay attention to what I say and what I don't say, and people who are going to be able to go check the primary documents or watch the full press conference or get access to the Twitter feeds that I have had access to as well. And so it's partly a much more upfront, in-your-face sense that you are writing to an audience of real people who are going to critique you when you get done with your project. The second thing is that the journalists are heavily into getting sourcing and comments and tips and amplification of news through citizen journalists. Starting with Katrina and the London bus bombings, there are ways now that people who shot their own pictures and posted them on websites and linked to other people's social media feeds, they became an integral part of the story and were celebrated by mainstream news organizations because they were on the scene, they had more vivid stuff, they were in a better position to talk about what was going on and what the reaction of people around them were. So this one-time war between the amateurs in the news environment, or what used to be the consumers, and the professionals doesn't exist anymore. There's not this sort of war of words between the pro-am communities that there used to be in the earliest days of blogging and stuff like that. But there are definitely ways now that journalists are very comfortable citing the tweets they see, the Facebook posts, the videos, the photos, gathering up comments from people who have shared their stories on Facebook. At sort of publications that pride themselves on fact-checking, where you literally have to hand in a file with all of the documentation about where you found things. This is now legitimate stuff, and in many cases, people their editors might ask, well, can you verify this yet another way? And sometimes, out of Iran, or out of the streets of Syria, it might be the only way to cite a voice that seems to be coming from the street. And so it's allowed into print, or it's allowed into a broadcast just because that's the best they can do at the time, and they're pretty careful about identifying maybe what its limitations are or the circumstances under which they found some information. But now it's a very integrated world where the user community is very much contributing to the news product. And the other way that this, of course, has influenced journalists' lives is that they now have a sense that they are constantly filing. They're constantly doing things. For a long time, there were segments in the news industry. The wire services would do up-to-date stuff. If there was breaking news during a big breaking news or something, that radio and TV would cover it. But they got away from that as the morning paper didn't become the up-to-date thing about what happened yesterday. People had already seen it on television or heard it on the radio yesterday. Well, now all of a sudden, all news organizations are back in the breaking news business, which is really interesting to see how correspondents respond to that. And there's a lot of encouragement, shall we say, by their bosses for lots of reporters to have blogs and to update their stories through social media.
Actually, I was going to go somewhat in the opposite direction and ask, given that Joe Blow on the ground in Louisiana can take photos on his iPhone of what's going on with Katrina, or pick any other location in the whole explosion of citizen journalism, do you think that changes the role of what a journalist's main function is, from just saying what happened to maybe adding some commentary and insight and making sense of it all?
There are some ways now that this new environment has sort of unpacked some of the traditional roles that traditional journalists used to have. And so there are ways now that storytelling is equally as much in the hands of citizens as it used to be in journalists. But sometimes nobody will go cover the city hall meeting or the mayor's event somewhere, and it's, as newspapers in particular and local news organizations are really financially stressed out. That's maybe a gap in local coverage now that didn't used to exist, but now they don't have the resources, or they will say, well, people maybe don't care about this as much or something like that. So there's a real segmenting going on, and different roles of the traditional media are being outsourced to other kinds of people, or they're being traded off with other people. But still, it's important to, I think people still rely on their news organizations to help them sort through what's most important, and still help them be filters for what's the most meaningful, consequential stuff. Help them figure out civic life. Local news organizations in particular know more about local political life than anybody else, including local nonprofit agencies or something like that. So people depend on it for those kind of things. For lots of other things now, the traditional smorgasbord approach of newspapers in particular, but also some broadcasts, will give you everything that you want. Sports is now something that a lot of other organizations do really well. Financial news is something that a lot of organizations do particularly well. It's not necessarily tied to locality. Weather is something that can be localized, but done with big databases pulled together by big sites. So there's a sort of breaking apart of the bundling that used to take place in lots of local news organizations, and pieces of the bundle are now better served for people in other kinds of outfits, but there are some things now that local news organizations are particularly good at.
There's a lot of news within the news industry about hyper-local news, and obviously AOLpatch.com/Huffington Post is the 800-pound gorilla in that space. Is there a sustainable business model for hyper-local news? Maybe AOL Patch has something going, but for somebody who's just in one market, because AOL Patch is, we're going to be in every market and have this huge infrastructure that we can kind of, allocate costs across 5,000 markets, whereas Joe Blow from Westport, Connecticut is only in that one market.
It's a very challenging thing. There are lots of hyperlocal organizations that are basically fueled by somebody's passion for it rather than their sense that they're going to make money, or the fact that they do make money. In many cases, they have to hold down other jobs, even while the thing that they most care about is the local activity that they're blogging about or their website is built around. The big variable in this, I think we'll know a lot more in 5 years, is the reaction of the local small business community. Right now it's a primary advertising market potentially for hyperlocal news. If I'm the local hardware store owner, or if I've got a print shop, or if I have a shoe store, there are ways now to think that the internet can serve me well. Chances are there's a vast majority of your potential customers use the internet and things, but there aren't necessarily robust local websites in that community, and you've advertised in the Yellow Pages forever, or you've advertised on placemats in the local restaurants, or you've got a nice big neon sign outside your store. Traditional methods of advertising are something that they feel very comfortable with, and so the willingness of the local merchants and advertising possibilities, that whether they go for online advertising or not is a big determinant of whether there's a real business model there or not.